It was 2 in the afternoon in Tepito, a neighborhood in Mexico City known for its strong community spirit, but also for its tense relationship with the authorities. Sofia Morales, a dark-skinned woman with curly hair, was calmly walking through the aisles of a local supermarket. Her expression was serene, although her mind was busy with organizing a charity event she was preparing for her community. She had spent years fighting for the rights of the most vulnerable, and her work had made her a respected figure in the area. However, that same afternoon, her life would take an unexpected turn. Juan Perez, a police officer patrolling the area, had been watching her since the moment Sofia entered the supermarket. He couldn't quite explain why, but something about her made him suspicious. Maybe it was her confident demeanor or simply the idea of seeing her in a place where, in his opinion, she didn't belong. Perez had a reputation among the residents of Tepito. Many knew that his patrols were harsher when it came to people with dark skin or humble appearances. For him, it was almost instinctive to suspect anyone who didn't fit into what he considered normal. As Sofia walked through the shelves, Perez decided to follow her. He walked a few steps behind, observing every movement, every item she placed in her cart. The officer kept a stern expression, fueled by years of prejudice that he couldn't hide. When she headed to the checkout to pay, Perez had already made up his mind. Sofia was doing something wrong, and he was going to make sure to expose her. Sofia didn't notice the officer until she was about to pay. She felt satisfied, knowing that everything she had bought would help feed many families during the event. But just as she handed over the money to the cashier, Perez quickly approached and blocked her path, giving her a look that made her feel small, though she was not. Before Sofia could ask what was happening, Perez demanded that she show her bag. Confused but maintaining the composure of someone who had faced many battles, Sofia tried to explain that she was buying food for a charity cause. However, the situation started to escalate. The calm she initially tried to maintain soon turned into a mix of surprise and anger. Never before had she experienced such degrading treatment in a public place. Instead of listening, Perez abruptly interrupted her, insinuating that she was stealing. The customers around began to pay attention, and the tension in the air became palpable. Although people didn't know who Sofia was, her educated and calm demeanor contrasted with Perez's aggression, making some begin to murmur among themselves. Without losing her dignity, Sofia agreed to open her bag, hoping that would end the situation. But Perez wasn't looking to find anything illegal. What he really wanted was to show his authority, to humiliate her in front of everyone. Without warning, he grabbed her arm and shoved her against one of the supermarket walls. The sound of products falling to the floor echoed through the store, and Sofia's face twisted in pain. The air in the store grew thick. Perez pressed Sofia's arm forcefully against her back, and although she tried to resist the pain, she didn't make a sound. She knew that any gesture or word could be misinterpreted, that if she raised her voice, she would be seen as aggressive or guilty. The reality was that, at that moment, nothing she did would change the situation. She was completely at the mercy of a man who couldn't see beyond her skin color. The store staff and customers watched in silence, some taking out their phones to record what was happening. Among them was Daniel, a young man who worked at the community center with Sofia. He knew her well and was aware of her dedication and commitment to the community. When he saw what was happening, something inside him snapped. He couldn't stay quiet, not when someone as respected as Sofia was being mistreated in such a way. Daniel began recording with his phone as he tried to get closer, but the scene was already out of control. Despite her attempts to calm the situation, Sofia was dragged out of the supermarket. Perez threw her to the ground with unnecessary force, and as he tried to handcuff her, a crowd gathered around. People began yelling at the officer, demanding that he stop. It was obvious that what he was doing was wrong, but Perez was too immersed in his anger to stop. What had begun as a simple grocery run had turned into a spectacle of unjustified brutality. Sofia, her face against the asphalt, could barely move. She felt the weight of Perez's body on top of her, and tears began to roll down her face, not just from the physical pain but from the helplessness of being treated this way in her own neighborhood. The street, which had always been a safe space for her, had now become a scene of public humiliation. Meanwhile, Daniel continued recording, his voice mixing with the shouts of people demanding justice. He knew that the only way to protect Sofia was by exposing what was happening. He had to make sure the higher authorities saw that video, that the community knew what had occurred. The incident wasn't just being witnessed in real time by the neighbors, but thanks to the recordings, it would be shared across the country within hours. Despite the pressure from the crowd, Perez didn't back down. His face was red with fury, and every time someone tried to get closer, he yelled at them to stay back. But the truth was, he no longer had control. What he was doing had no justification, and the community knew it. The murmurs turned into shouts. People who had been just watching began moving closer, inching towards Perez and Sofia. In the midst of all the chaos, Sofia realized that her life would never be the same. The afternoon had begun to descend into chaos. What initially had been just a disturbing scene inside the supermarket had now turned into a full-blown uproar in the middle of the street. The sidewalks in front of the store were crowded with onlookers, neighbors, and passers-by who had stopped to witness what was happening. No one could believe what they were seeing: Sofia, one of the most respected people in the community, lying on the ground, immobilized by the brutal weight of a police officer, while her face clearly showed pain and humiliation. Perez, however, seemed oblivious to everything happening around him. The shouts of the people didn't break through the wall of rage and arrogance that surrounded him. To him, Sofia was simply another obstacle in his path, just one more person who had to be subdued, like so many others he had intimidated in his career. He felt the adrenaline coursing through his body, as if this display of excessive power was something that fueled him. Sofia, with her cheek pressed against the hot asphalt, could hear the shouts echoing around her, but it all seemed distant. Her mind was torn between the physical pain and the indignation she felt. She knew that what was happening wasn't just an act of brutality, but a raw representation of the racism that still thrived in every corner of society. She was being treated like a criminal, not because of her actions, but because of the color of her skin. The asphalt burned beneath her face, and the pressure on her back became unbearable. Every time she tried to take a deep breath, Perez tightened the handcuffs, making the pain intensify. In her mind, she replayed the events of the day. It had started so normally, so full of hope for the community event she was organizing. Now, her world had shrunk to this small space on the ground, to these moments of anguish, while the crowd grew and the tension escalated. Meanwhile, Daniel kept recording everything with his phone, aware that this was the only way to seek justice. He couldn't get too close, but his voice, firm and clear, rose above the noise of the crowd. He knew that if he didn't do something, the situation could end in something much worse. He had heard stories of police abuses that spiraled out of control, of how a simple arrest could end in tragedy. He wasn't going to let that happen to Sofia. Perez, feeling the pressure from the crowd closing in, began to lose his composure. His breathing became irregular, and his movements grew more clumsy, almost desperate. He wasn't used to being challenged this way. The insults and accusations from the neighbors were throwing him off balance, making him feel cornered. But instead of backing down, he doubled down on his aggression. Suddenly, Perez roughly lifted Sofia off the ground, forcing her to stand up with a sharp tug, indifferent to the pain he was causing her. The momentary silence of the crowd broke into a collective roar of outrage. No one could believe the brutality with which she was being treated, and the cell phones kept recording every second. Perez gripped Sofia's arm tightly as he pushed her towards his patrol car, parked a few meters away. Despite the pain, Sofia held her head high. She wasn't going to let this man break her, no matter how hard he hit her. She knew she was innocent, and although she was being treated like a criminal, her dignity remained intact. With each step she took toward the patrol car, her thoughts extended beyond the situation at hand. She thought of her community, of the injustices she had always fought against, and how this scene was yet another manifestation of the structural racism she had long denounced. Sofia's body trembled, not just from the physical pain, but from the whirlwind of emotions flooding her. As she walked, she heard the shouts of support from the crowd. Though she was scared, she felt strengthened by the knowledge that she wasn't alone. She knew that Daniel and the others were there to witness it all, to make sure the truth wasn't distorted. It was as if the energy of her community was surrounding her, protecting her in this vulnerable moment. Daniel, still recording, took another step closer, raising his voice with courage. He shouted at Perez, telling him that he was being filmed, that the entire community was watching what he was doing, and that he wouldn't escape the consequences. Daniel's words rang out in the air, but Perez ignored them. He was too deep in his role of authority to stop. To him, Sofia was still an object of his contempt, a woman who deserved nothing but repression. When they reached the patrol car, Perez tried to shove Sofia inside violently. The door slammed shut with a sharp thud, the sound reverberating like a gunshot in the ears of the crowd. People kept shouting, but no one dared get too close. Daniel bit his lip in frustration. He knew something worse could happen if he didn't intervene in some way. That's when he had an idea. Quickly, Daniel uploaded the video to social media. He knew that in minutes, the video would go viral and that the situation couldn't be hidden. As the video began to circulate, some of those present also began streaming live. Social media exploded with comments and reactions from people all over the country. What started as police abuse in a small community was about to become a national scandal. Inside the patrol car, Sofia tried to steady her breathing. The handcuffs were still tight around her wrists, and her whole body ached. She could hear the noise of the crowd outside, but there was nothing she could do except wait. She felt a mix of fear and rage, a fury burning inside her with no way out. She couldn't stop thinking about how many others had gone through the same thing, how many times this kind of injustice had gone unpunished. As the car started moving, Perez glanced at the rearview mirror. His hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, but he couldn't afford to show weakness. He knew what he had done was wrong, but he wasn't going to admit it, not in front of the crowd. The problem, however, was that this time there were too many witnesses, too many eyes that had seen what he had done. The patrol car slowly drove away from the scene, as the shouts of the crowd faded into the distance. But Sofia's story was only just beginning. Although she was hurt and scared, she knew that what had happened wouldn't stay there. She wasn't going to let her fight end that way. What Perez didn't understand was that his abuse of power had awakened something much bigger, something that was about to explode. The patrol car moved slowly, but the crowd didn't disperse. The tension in the air was palpable. While Sofia was taken away in silence, the streets of Tepito began to boil with the indignation of those who had witnessed the abuse. What had started as a small group of onlookers had turned into a gathering of furious neighbors, demanding answers. To them, Sofia wasn't just a leader, she was a symbol of resistance against the injustices they had endured for so long. The neighborhood, which had always had a tense relationship with the police, had reached a boiling point. Daniel, still holding his phone, watched as notifications poured in. Within minutes, the video he had recorded had thousands of views and was being shared everywhere. He knew time was against him. He had to act before the system, as it had so many times before, tried to cover up what had happened. Without thinking twice, he decided to call local media outlets and several human rights organizations that Sofia had worked with in the past. It was urgent that the incident be known beyond the neighborhood, that the voices of the witnesses be heard beyond social media. Meanwhile, on the streets, the outrage began to organize. A group of young people, some of them members of the community center that Sofia ran, began chanting slogans demanding justice. Cries of "Sofia is not alone" echoed between the buildings, and within minutes, more people joined in. The neighbors, many of whom had experienced police harassment firsthand, saw in Sofia's arrest an opportunity to denounce the abuses they had endured for years. Doors opened, and one by one, neighbors began to step outside. Some brought hastily made signs, others raised their fists in protest. What Perez had started as a simple act of repression had quickly transformed into a massive demonstration. The entire neighborhood seemed to awaken from a state of fear and submission. As Daniel watched his neighbors take to the streets, he felt a mix of pride and responsibility. He knew that it was now up to them to keep up the pressure so that the incident wouldn't fade away into rumors and manipulations. The main street of Tepito, usually filled with vendors and customers, had now become the stage for an improvised protest. People shouted, demanding Sofia's release and punishment for Perez. Although no one said it out loud, everyone knew this moment could be the spark for something bigger. The racial and class tensions, which had always been simmering, were now about to explode. In the crowd, an elderly woman known in the community as Dona Maria began speaking with the young people who were organizing. Dona Maria had lived in Tepito her whole life and knew firsthand the abuses the police had committed in the neighborhood. She remembered the days when officers would enter homes without permission, when raids became excuses to intimidate families. But today felt different to her. She sensed that the neighborhood was no longer willing to accept more violence or repression. While Dona Maria talked with the young people, some neighbors began blocking the streets with whatever they could find. Old furniture, wooden crates, and even cars were used to create makeshift barricades. It was a symbolic act of resistance, a way of telling the police that they weren't welcome. The atmosphere in the neighborhood was increasingly tense, but it was also charged with a sense of unity that hadn't been seen in years. Daniel remained at the forefront. After sending the videos to several media contacts, he began walking through the crowd, making sure everyone was recording what was happening. He knew the key to preventing the police from acting more violently was visibility. The more cameras there were, the less likely it was that they would try to suppress the protest with brutality. Some of his friends, who were activists, also began live streaming from different angles, showing the whole country how the neighborhood of Tepito was rising up against injustice. The arrival of more police officers wasn't long in coming. Within minutes, several patrol cars began to surround the main streets. But this time, the community wasn't willing to back down. The police, led by an officer who seemed much more calculating than Perez, approached slowly, trying to assess the situation. It was clear they hadn't expected such a massive reaction. The officers communicated over the radio, trying to decide their next move. However, the group of protesters was determined not to budge. The street no longer belonged to the police but to the neighbors demanding justice. Inside the patrol car, while being taken to the station, Sophia could feel her phone vibrating in her pocket. She couldn't answer, but she knew Daniel and their people would be doing the right thing. Although she felt the pain in her wrists from the handcuffs, her spirit wasn't broken. She knew the neighborhood wouldn't abandon her. She thought of all the times she had spoken on behalf of those who couldn't defend themselves, of how she had always tried to be a voice of hope. Now, ironically, it was she who needed to be defended. As the hours passed, more people from the community began arriving at the scene. Some brought food and water for the protesters, while others came with their families just to be part of the historic moment that was unfolding. The streets of Tepito, which were normally lively with the bustle of markets and vendors, had now become the epicenter of a movement demanding justice. The chants continued to echo in the air, and little by little, news of Sophia's arrest began to circulate in the media. Journalists arrived with their cameras, trying to capture the atmosphere on the streets. Reporters interviewed neighbors, and they all said the same thing: Sofia Morales was innocent, and what had happened was nothing more than another act of racial and police brutality. Daniel, exhausted but determined, kept organizing the people. He knew it was only a matter of time before they tried to disperse them, but he also knew that the more people who joined, the harder it would be for the police to act with impunity. The entire neighborhood had awakened, and there was no turning back. Suddenly, a shout came from a corner. Someone had received crucial information. Among the crowd, there was a rumor that something big was about to happen, something that would change the course of everything they were experiencing. The tension in the streets of Tepito had reached its peak. Neighbors continued to fill the sidewalks, blocking the streets with improvised barricades, while the police kept a tense watch, trying to decide what their next move would be. The sun began to set over the city, painting the sky a deep orange, while the crowd chanted Sophia's name and demanded her release. As the hours passed, the rumor that something unexpected was about to happen grew among the crowd. Everyone was waiting for a response, but what happened next surprised everyone, even the police officers who, up until that moment, had felt untouchable. Inside the patrol car, Sophia kept her head resting against the window, watching the city speed by. She felt a sharp pain in her wrists from the handcuffs, and every jolt of the vehicle seemed to make her discomfort worse. Despite the physical and emotional exhaustion, she refused to show weakness. She knew there were cameras watching her every move and that any gesture could be manipulated against her. Officer Juan Perez, driving with a tense expression, remained silent. Although he tried to maintain his composure on the outside, something inside him was beginning to stir. He hadn't anticipated that the situation would escalate this much. What had started as a routine arrest for him, just another opportunity to show his authority, had now become a problem beyond his control. People had recorded his abuse of power, and although his first reaction had been to ignore the crowd's accusations, he couldn't stop thinking about the possible consequences. Fear was beginning to creep in. Sophia, on the other hand, remained calm, though her mind was racing. She thought of Daniel, of the community fighting for her, and of what might happen if the situation wasn't resolved soon. She was sure they wouldn't abandon her, but she also knew she had to stay calm to prevent things from getting worse. Then, suddenly, a thought crossed her mind: if Daniel had spread the video, someone else must have intervened by now. And she was right. At the central police station, while Sophia was being transported, a senior officer had received an urgent call. The name Morales had echoed in the conversation, and what had seemed like just another incident in Tepito had suddenly become a sensitive matter. That officer, looking at the report in front of him, froze for a few seconds. He couldn't believe what he was reading. Sofia Morales wasn't just a community leader, she was the wife of the mayor of Mexico City. Panic began to spread within the police station. The higher-ranking officers looked at each other, trying to process the consequences of what they had just discovered. Not only had they arrested a prominent figure, but they had acted with violence and discrimination against someone who, in addition to being well-known and respected, had direct connections to the highest levels of power. The news spread like wildfire among the officers, and the atmosphere in the station changed immediately. What had previously been seen as a routine arrest had now turned into a political scandal. As Perez's patrol car neared the station, one of the senior officers hurried out of the building and began making frantic calls. He knew that any further mistake could trigger a crisis. While he spoke on the phone, a group of reporters who had arrived to cover the Tepito incident began gathering in front of the station, increasing the pressure. The cameras were ready, the questions hung in the air, and the journalists weren't going to leave without an official statement. Perez, unaware of what was happening at the station, parked the car with the same coldness he had shown throughout the drive. He turned off the engine, opened his door, and got out, prepared to drag Sofia out of the car as he had done before. But just as he was about to open the back door, he was intercepted by one of the senior officers, who hurried toward him with a visibly upset expression. The officer planted himself in front of Perez, blocking his path. Perez looked at him in confusion. He didn't understand why his superior seemed so agitated, but before he could ask, the officer shot him a furious glare. The moment of truth had arrived. The officer, unable to contain his anger, told him in a low voice that he had made a serious mistake. Sofia Morales wasn't just another woman from the neighborhood, she was the wife of the mayor. Perez felt the blood drain from his veins. His entire world was suddenly shaken. The woman he had treated so brutally, whom he had handcuffed and humiliated in front of her own community, had a direct connection to the most powerful man in the city. Now he understood why the situation had escalated so much, why the crowd had become so aggressive. He realized that he hadn't just arrested someone, he had triggered a political bomb. Sofia, who had been listening to everything from inside the car, couldn't help but smile slightly. Not because she was pleased with the situation, but because she knew that the revelation of her identity would change the dynamics of the conflict. The police could no longer treat her like just anyone. She knew that her status would force the officers to act more cautiously, though that didn't mean everything would end well. There were still many unanswered questions. Perez, paralyzed by fear, tried to justify his actions, stammering excuses, but his superior wasn't interested in listening. He immediately ordered him to release Sofia. Perez's face turned white, and with trembling hands, he pulled out the handcuff keys. He approached the back door of the patrol car, opened it, and clumsily freed Sofia. She, maintaining her dignity, slowly stepped out of the vehicle and looked at him with a mix of calm and disdain. Though her wrists were red and sore from the pressure of the handcuffs, she showed no sign of weakness. She knew she was in control of the situation now. Some officers tried to surround her to escort her into the station, but she ignored them. She knew the damage had already been done, and all that was left was to make sure the truth came out. The crowd gathered in front of the station watched as Sofia emerged from the vehicle. Some began to applaud, others shouted her name, and the reporters rushed toward her with questions. But Sofia said nothing. She held her head high as she walked toward the building. Inside the station, the atmosphere was tense. The officers, who had previously been prepared to carry out a simple arrest, now moved nervously, aware that everything they did was being watched by cameras. The police chief, who had been urgently called in, waited for Sophia at the entrance. When he saw her arrive, he approached with a falsely cordial expression, trying to smooth over what was clearly a situation out of control. Sophia looked him directly in the eyes and, without saying a word, demanded that everything that had happened be investigated. She knew the system was designed to protect its own, but at that moment, with all the media attention and the pressure from her community, she was ready to fight to the end. The first hours after Sophia's release were frenetic. Social media exploded with news of her arrest, and the images of police brutality began circulating throughout the country. The videos taken by Daniel and other members of the community became the focus of national and international media. Headlines screamed Sofia Morales's name, not just as another victim of police violence, but as the woman who had exposed the depth of corruption and systemic racism that still permeated the institutions in Mexico City. The neighborhood of Tepito, for its part, had transformed into the epicenter of a social movement that was gaining more and more strength. The streets, which for hours had been the scene of a spontaneous protest, were now more organized. Neighbors had begun coordinating with community leaders and activists to ensure that Sophia's arrest wouldn't fade into obscurity. The tense atmosphere remained, but now there was also a renewed sense of purpose. They knew it was time to demand real change. Sophia, after being released, hadn't gone directly home. Although her body was still sore and her mind exhausted, she decided to go to the community center she had founded years ago, the same place where Daniel and so many other young people had learned to fight for their rights. Upon arrival, she was greeted with a wave of applause and hugs. The people from her community surrounded her, some with tears in their eyes, others with faces filled with pride for the courage she had shown. However, inside, Sophia knew the battle was far from over. As she looked at the faces of those around her, she understood that the real challenge was just beginning. It wasn't just about her case, but about the thousands of cases that had never been recorded, the stories of abuse that had never come to light. Every person there with her had a story to tell, a wound caused by a system that had failed them time and time again. The next day, while the media continued reporting on the case, Sophia called for an emergency meeting at the community center. She wanted to organize a massive protest that would not only denounce her arrest but demand structural reforms. Alongside her, Daniel, always loyal and determined, helped coordinate every detail. There was something in the air, a feeling that things could change if they managed to keep up the pressure. The entire neighborhood mobilized. What had initially been a protest against Sophia's unjust arrest had now expanded into a broader struggle against institutional racism, police brutality, and the inequality that suffocated the most vulnerable communities. Preparations for the march moved quickly, and social media became a key driver in spreading the message. Meanwhile, local and federal authorities began to feel the pressure. The mayor, Sophia's husband, found himself in an extremely delicate position. Though he tried to remain publicly neutral, the situation put him at a crossroads. He knew his political career was on the line, but he also understood that the system of which he was a part had failed, and it had failed badly. Despite the tensions in her home, Sophia stood firm. She knew she couldn't rely on her husband to resolve the situation, nor did she want her personal relationship to be seen as the sole reason for her fight. From the beginning, her cause had been about justice for her community, and she wouldn't allow the narrative to be distorted. Sophia spoke directly to him, making it clear that while she appreciated his support, this was a time for him to take a firm stance, not just as her husband, but as the leader of the city. The night before the protest, the community center was buzzing with activity. Volunteers were making signs, printing leaflets, and organizing the different groups that would participate in the march. Some were worried about possible police repression, but most felt a renewed strength. It had been a long time since the community of Tepito had risen up like this, and now they felt they had a real chance to be heard. The day of the protest dawned with a cloudy sky, but that didn't stop the crowd from gathering in the streets. Thousands of people, not just from Tepito but from nearby neighborhoods and other parts of the city, arrived to join the march. The signs were clear in their messages. They demanded justice, not just for Sofia, but for all victims of police brutality. The chants of resistance and slogans against racism echoed in the air, filling the streets with an energy that hadn't been seen in years. Sofia led the march, walking at the front alongside Daniel and other community leaders. Despite her exhaustion, her presence radiated determination. The media followed her closely, capturing her every step. But for her, that day wasn't about attention. It was about justice. She knew that what she was doing transcended her own personal story. She was fighting for those who had never had a camera to record their abuse, for those whose names weren't known but whose lives had been destroyed by a system that marginalized them. As they moved through the main streets of Mexico City, the chants grew louder. The crowd swelled, and the voices of those demanding change united as one. Sofia felt a mix of emotions. On the one hand, she was filled with pride for what her community had managed to organize in such a short time. But on the other hand, she knew the road to real change would be long and full of obstacles. The protest proceeded without major incidents, despite the massive police presence, who seemed to be watching every move, knowing that any mistake could trigger a larger crisis. The officers, many of whom were uncomfortable with the media attention surrounding the event, stayed on the sidelines, watching from the sidewalks. When they reached the Zocalo, the city's main square, Sofia climbed onto the stage that the organizers had set up. In front of her, a crowd of thousands waited for her words. She took a deep breath before beginning. She knew that what she said at that moment would be remembered for a long time. She knew that people needed more than words of comfort, they needed a plan, a direction. Sofia took the microphone and, in a firm voice, began speaking about the need for deep reforms. It wasn't just about sanctioning the officers involved in her arrest. It was about changing the policies that allowed racism and police violence to be so common. She demanded the implementation of anti-racism training programs for the police, the creation of citizen review committees to investigate abuses, and the dismantling of discriminatory practices that affected the most vulnerable communities. The crowd cheered, supporting each of her words. But Sofia knew that the real work would begin after the march. As the echo of the protest resonated throughout Mexico City, the impact of Sofia's speech and the massive mobilization was felt in every corner of the country. The march, which had begun as an immediate response to her unjust arrest, transformed into a symbol of the fight against systemic inequality that affected not only Black people and marginalized communities but the entire population that had been victims of abuses of power. The next day, as national headlines spoke of the protest's success and Sofia's leadership, something unexpected began to happen within the corridors of power. The pressure exerted not only by the community but by journalists, human rights organizations, and social media was forcing the authorities to take urgent action. Politicians who for years had turned a deaf ear to reports of police brutality were now forced to speak out, fearful of losing popular support in a time of growing social unrest. Sofia, however, knew that the public displays of solidarity from many of those politicians were empty. She had learned over the years that while words could have influence, only concrete actions would bring about the change they so desperately sought. That's why she refused to get carried away by the moment of euphoria. She gathered her trusted team, Daniel, and the other community leaders to plan the next steps. She knew that without proper follow-up, the media attention would soon fade, and the promises of reform would be forgotten. Meanwhile, within the police force itself, Sofia's arrest had caused internal divisions. Some officers, embarrassed by the negative attention they had received, began questioning the racist and violent practices that had been tolerated and even encouraged within the institution for years. Others, like Juan Perez, tried to justify their actions, claiming they were just doing their job. However, the fear of possible legal consequences began to grip those who knew that their abuse of power was being closely scrutinized. Perez, in particular, felt the pressure most intensely. Since the day of the march, his life had become a whirlwind of uncertainty. His superiors had summoned him to several meetings, and although he had not yet been officially suspended, his position in the force hung by a thread. His initial arrogance had completely disappeared, and now he was a scared man, aware that the power he had once wielded with such confidence was crumbling before his eyes. A few days after the march, as Perez nervously checked his phone, he received an unexpected call. It was a former police academy colleague, someone who had risen through the ranks and now worked in one of the highest government offices. The voice on the other end of the line made it clear that things weren't going well for him. The investigations into Sofia's case had begun, and the evidence against him, especially the videos, was irrefutable. Perez tried to defend himself, claiming he had just followed protocol, but his colleague cut him off sharply. He warned him that the best thing he could do was prepare a solid defense because it was likely he would be dismissed and face charges. Perez hung up the phone, feeling desperation wash over him. He knew his career was over, but what tormented him most was the fact that he had become the scapegoat for a corrupt system that, until then, had protected him. Now, he was alone. At the same time, the community of Tepito remained mobilized. Sofia and her team had begun drafting a series of reform proposals to present to the local and federal governments. The demands went beyond the police. They called for changes in the education system, access to better job opportunities, and the elimination of policies that perpetuated racial inequality in Mexico. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they also knew they had a unique opportunity to push for real change. Reactions to these proposals weren't long in coming. While some political sectors tried to divert attention with empty promises, others were openly hostile. The more conservative media outlets began attacking Sofia, accusing her of being an agitator trying to destabilize the country. Some influential public figures labeled her an extremist, suggesting that her demands were impossible to meet. Sofia, however, was used to attacks. She knew that when a black woman raised her voice in a deeply racist country, violent reactions were inevitable. But that didn't stop her. If she had learned anything from her years of activism, it was that the moments of greatest resistance were the ones that preceded change. Meanwhile, the mayor, her husband, continued to face increasing pressure. In private, discussions between him and Sofia became more tense. Although he tried to support her publicly, it was becoming increasingly difficult for him to deal with the demands of the political parties that backed him, many of whom opposed the reforms she was proposing. The situation at home was complicated, and the weight of politics was beginning to wear down their relationship. One afternoon, after a long meeting with her team, Sofia sat alone in her office at the community center. Through the window, she could see children playing in the nearby park, the same park she had helped build years ago. Despite everything that was happening, she felt a strange calm. She knew that things wouldn't change overnight, but she also knew they had already achieved the impossible. They had brought to light the brutality and racism that many tried to deny. And this was only the beginning. That same night, an unexpected call came to her phone. It was a high-level political figure, someone who had remained silent throughout the scandal. The man on the other end of the line with a serious voice, offered her a private meeting. He said he wanted to discuss the reforms she was proposing, but Sophia suspected it was something more. She knew that the forces of the system were maneuvering, trying to protect themselves, but she had no intention of backing down. Before hanging up, the man told her that, while he respected her fight, she needed to be careful. The power she was challenging wouldn't give in easily, and the consequences could be devastating. Sophia listened in silence, without interrupting. When he finished, she responded firmly. She knew the road would be difficult, but there was no turning back. After hanging up, she stayed in the darkness of her office for a moment, staring into the void. She was determined. The days following the mysterious call were a whirlwind for Sophia. The warning she had received didn't surprise her, but the concern of those around her was starting to wear on her spirit. Daniel, her closest ally, and the other community leaders insisted she take extra precautions. The implied threats in the politicians' words were clear: the system wasn't going to give in without a fight, and the cost of challenging it could be high. At home, the tension with her husband had become unbearable. Dinners, which used to be moments of rest and conversation, had now turned into uncomfortable silences or arguments about the direction the city was taking. For the mayor, the situation was almost unsustainable. While he personally supported Sophia's demands, as a politician, he found himself caught between the expectations of the parties that had brought him to power and the growing demands of his wife and the community. One night, after a particularly tense meeting at City Hall, he came home with a tired and worried expression. He sat down in front of Sophia, staring at the table, unsure of where to start. Finally, in a low voice, he told her that she should consider slowing down the pace of her fight. He argued that reforms would take time, that they needed to be more diplomatic, and that open confrontation would only bring more problems. It was a plea, almost a beg, but Sophia saw it differently. It was a sign that he had already given in to the system. Sophia listened in silence, but when he finished, she simply shook her head. She told him that she couldn't afford to stop. Not now, when they had achieved so much. Not now, when the whole country was watching. She knew what she was asking wasn't easy, that their relationship was fraying with every step she took, but for her, the cause was more important than any personal sacrifice. The mayor, frustrated and feeling powerless, stood up from the table and left the room without saying another word. That night, as Sophia sat in her living room, surrounded by documents and plans for upcoming mobilizations, she felt the weight of loneliness like never before. Although she was surrounded by support, the fight seemed to have become more personal, more intimate. She knew her relationship with her husband was faltering, but she also knew she couldn't abandon what she had started. Every step backward would be a victory for those who wanted nothing to change. The next morning, she returned to the community center, where Daniel and the others were already waiting for another meeting. The discussions revolved around the legal actions they were taking against the officers involved in her arrest, but also about the growing pressure from conservative media, which were relentlessly attacking her. Every day, new articles appeared accusing her of trying to destabilize the country, of being a threat to social order. Some public figures, backed by business interests, began launching smear campaigns, seeking to erode Sophia's image as a fair leader. Daniel, worried, showed her an especially aggressive article in one of the country's major magazines. The headline described her as a dangerous radical who only wanted to fuel chaos in the streets. Sophia, reading carefully, realized that the attacks weren't just personal, but strategic. The system was trying to discredit her before her movement gained more strength. But she knew the truth was on her side, and as long as she had the support of her community, she wouldn't give in to the intimidation. The following weeks focused on organizing a new march, one that would take their demands directly to the heart of the federal government. This time, it wasn't just about police brutality. The goal was to challenge the deeper structures of inequality and racism that had been ingrained in Mexico for generations. The community of Tepito, which had been the epicenter of the movement, was now joined by other marginalized communities from across the country. The mobilization was expanding, and Sofia knew they were approaching a point of no return. As the date of the march approached, tensions increased. Local authorities, pressured by the growing support for Sofia's demands, began sending mixed messages. While some officials talked about opening dialogues with community leaders, others reinforced the police presence on the streets as a form of intimidation. Helicopters began to hover over Tepito, and patrols roamed the neighborhood more frequently. Although the threats weren't explicit, the message was clear: the government wasn't willing to tolerate another large mobilization. One night, just 2 days before the march, Sofia received an unexpected visit at the community center. It was a delegation of federal government officials. They wanted to speak with her privately, away from the cameras and media attention. They were polite, but the underlying message was one of warning. They offered her a deal. In exchange for canceling the march, they promised to implement some of the reforms she demanded, but gradually, under controlled terms. They insisted there was no need for more confrontation, that the country couldn't handle another social crisis. Sofia listened to every word carefully, but inside, she already knew what her response would be. The next day, she met with Daniel and the other leaders. She told them what had happened, and although some were worried about possible reprisals, most agreed that they couldn't accept the government's conditions. They knew that any closed-door deal would only serve to dilute their fight. The march would go ahead, without compromises. On the day of the march, the streets of Mexico City were filled with tension. Thousands of people were expected, and the entire city was under surveillance. The media, both national and international, were closely monitoring every move. Television cameras followed Sofia as she walked at the front of the crowd, with Daniel and other community leaders by her side. The atmosphere was one of anticipation, but also fear. No one knew how the authorities would react to a protest of this magnitude. As the march progressed, the chants of resistance and justice filled the air. Sofia, with a determined gaze, knew they were making history. But she also knew that the cost of challenging the system was high, and that the future of her community, and her own life, was at stake. The day of the march had arrived. Mexico City, usually noisy with traffic and daily life, was now silent with anticipation, interrupted only by the chants and slogans of thousands of protesters marching through the main streets. From the most humble neighborhoods to the heart of political power, the city vibrated with the energy of a community determined to demand justice. Sofia Morales's footsteps echoed strongly at the front of the crowd, each step filled with determination. The air was thick with tension but also with hope. They knew this moment was crucial. As the march moved toward the National Palace, the atmosphere grew heavier. Police patrols lined the streets, and helicopters hovered overhead like vigilant raptors. The protesters remained calm, aware that any provocation could be used against them. However, the massive police presence reminded everyone that the system was prepared to defend itself, even if that meant suppressing those calling for legitimate changes. Sofia walked with her head held high, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the National Palace stood imposingly. Each step brought her closer to the goal, but she also felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She knew there was much at stake: her community, her struggle, and, above all, the trust of those who had supported her unconditionally throughout this process. But beyond that, she knew this march wasn't just for her. It was for all the victims of injustice, for those whose voices had never been heard. This was a moment to change the course of history. As they neared the plaza, counter-protesters began to appear. They shouted against the mobilization, carrying signs accusing Sofia of destabilizing the country and wanting to disrupt the order. Some were organized by conservative sectors, while others were ordinary citizens concerned about the repercussions of the community's demands. The tension grew with every second. Sofia, however, remained composed. She knew these kinds of provocations were inevitable and that the government had likely allowed their presence to delegitimize the protest. Daniel, walking beside her, whispered not to worry, reminding her that most of the people were with them and that history would judge those who had tried to stop the march. Sofia nodded, but inside she felt something big was about to happen. When they finally arrived at the Zocalo, the city's main square, thousands of people were already waiting for them. The crowd grew by the minute, and the noise was deafening. The signs demanded justice, equality, and an end to police brutality. From the stage set up for speeches, the organizers tried to keep control of the situation, but they knew the pressure was immense. Everyone knew this was a point of no return. As Sofia prepared to step onto the stage and give her speech, the atmosphere became even more tense. Reporters crowded around, ready to capture every word, every gesture. But just as Sofia was about to take the microphone, something unexpected happened. A group of plainclothes officers appeared in the crowd, walking quickly toward her. The people around Sofia tensed, but instead of arresting her, the officers surrounded her protectively. One of them, with a serious but respectful expression, quietly told her that he had received direct orders from the government to escort her to the National Palace. The president, who had remained silent until that moment, wanted to speak with her privately. The news dropped like a bomb among the crowd. Everyone fell silent for a few seconds, processing what had just happened. Daniel, worried, approached Sofia and begged her not to go. He felt it was a trap, a way to remove her from the movement at its most crucial moment. But Sofia, after thinking for a few seconds, decided to accept the invitation. She knew that if the president was willing to meet with her, it was an opportunity she couldn't pass up. She told Daniel to continue the march in her name and to stay calm. Although something inside her told her this could be dangerous, Sofia was determined to seize the moment. The police escort took her in an official car to the National Palace. As they drove through the streets, Sofia thought about everything she had experienced in recent weeks, how her life had changed so radically. When they arrived at the palace, she was greeted by high-level officials who led her to a private meeting room. There, sitting in front of her, was the most powerful figure in the country, the president. He looked at her with a calm expression, but there was visible tension on his face. He began the meeting with polite formality, thanking her for her fight and acknowledging the bravery of her community. However, it quickly became clear that the president wasn't there just to listen. His tone shifted rapidly, and he made it clear that while he understood her demands, he couldn't allow the country to fall into chaos because of a protest movement. He offered a series of superficial reforms, something that could temporarily appease public opinion but that Sofia knew wouldn't solve the deeper problems. It was a tempting offer for any politician looking to preserve their reputation, but Sofia wasn't a conventional politician. In a firm voice, she rejected the deal. She told the president that she wasn't there to negotiate for crumbs but to demand real change, and if he wasn't willing to commit to that, then the fight would continue. The president, surprised by her response, tried to pressure her, warning her about the possible consequences of continuing the protests. But Sofia didn't back down. She knew she couldn't betray her community or everything they had achieved up to that point. The meeting ended abruptly, with an implicit promise that things would get more difficult from that moment on. When Sophia left the National Palace, she was greeted by thousands of people still gathered in the square, waiting for news. When they saw her, the crowd erupted in applause. They knew she hadn't given in, that she hadn't betrayed them. Sophia climbed onto the stage, took the microphone, and in a clear and firm voice, told them that the fight would continue. There would be no surrender. The crowd chanted her name, and at that moment, Sophia realized that the real power didn't reside in the halls of government but in the hands of the people willing to fight for a better future. The battle wasn't over, but now, more than ever, she was certain that victory was within reach. And so, under the gray skies of Mexico City, resistance turned into hope, and hope into action. The movement led by Sofía Morales had not only exposed injustice but had awakened an entire nation. If you enjoyed this emotional story of struggle and resilience, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. Give it a like, share it with your friends, and leave a comment below telling us what you thought of this journey of resistance and bravery. Your opinion is very important. And don't leave just yet. Watch the video appearing on the end screen to keep inspiring yourself with more powerful stories. See you next time. Until then.